Welcome to Cloud, the channel where epic stories meet epic people like you. Grab a snack, sit back, and let's make your day a little more interesting. So without further ado, let's go. Story 1. The Johnsons. It all started when the Johnsons moved in. They seemed like a typical family, a couple in their late 30s with 2 kids and a small dog. Our neighborhood, a quiet, suburban street where everyone looked out for each other, welcomed them with open arms. My wife Sarah and I, along with our 2 kids, were hopeful that they'd fit right in. We first met them as they were unloading their U-Haul. Sarah and I went over to introduce ourselves, bringing along a plate of brownies as a welcome gift. "Thanks so much," Karen Johnson said, smiling as she took the plate. "We're looking forward to meeting everyone. Moving is such a hassle, but we're excited to be here." It all seemed pleasant enough. We chatted for a bit, and they seemed friendly, if a little stressed from the move. But as the weeks went by, it became clear that things were not going to be as peaceful as we had hoped. The first sign of trouble was the noise. It started with some occasional loud music. Nothing out of the ordinary, just typical sounds of people settling into a new home. But soon, the noise became a constant issue. Every weekend, the Johnsons would have gatherings in their backyard that lasted late into the night. It wasn't just music. It was shouting, laughing, and sometimes even the revving of engines as their friends came and went. One night, at around midnight, I decided to go over and politely ask them to keep it down. I rang the doorbell, and after a long pause, Steve Johnson opened the door. He was holding a beer, and I could hear the commotion in the background. "Hey, sorry to bother you," I said, trying to sound as friendly as possible. "It's just getting a little late, and we've got work in the morning. Could you maybe turn the music down a bit?" Steve gave me a look that was somewhere between annoyed and dismissive. "Yeah, sure. We'll keep it down," he said, then shut the door without another word. The music did lower, but it was clear that my request wasn't appreciated. Sarah and I could still hear them laughing and talking loudly into the early hours of the morning, and we ended up having to close all the windows just to get some sleep. It wasn't just the noise that became a problem. The Johnsons treated their backyard like a party zone, and the mess quickly spilled over into the rest of the neighborhood. Trash bags were often left out for days, attracting raccoons and other critters. The wind would carry litter into our yard and the yards of other neighbors. Empty beer cans, cigarette butts, and plastic cups seemed to be a permanent fixture on their lawn. Sarah and I tried to overlook it, telling ourselves they were just going through a rough patch. But it became harder to ignore when we found broken glass scattered in our driveway one morning, clearly blown over from one of their weekend get-togethers. When Sarah stepped on a piece while taking out the trash, cutting her foot, we decided it was time to address the issue. We invited the Johnsons over for coffee, hoping that a friendly conversation would help resolve things. Karen seemed receptive at first, but as soon as we brought up the noise and the trash, her demeanor changed. "We're just trying to live our lives," Karen said defensively. "It's not like we're doing anything illegal. We're not asking you to stop having fun," Sarah said calmly. "We just need you to be a little more considerate of everyone else. We've got kids, and so do a lot of our neighbors." Steve, who had been mostly quiet during the conversation, finally spoke up. "Look, we didn't move here to be policed by our neighbors. We're not bothering anyone on purpose. If you got a problem, you can take it up with the HOA." It was clear the conversation wasn't going anywhere, and we ended it on a tense note, with neither side feeling heard. Max, the Johnson small terrier, was another point of contention. He was an energetic dog, constantly barking and digging under the fence that separated our yards. He'd frequently escape and run around the neighborhood, chasing after kids on bikes or cars driving down the street. One afternoon, while I was mowing the lawn, Max broke through the fence and darted into our yard, tearing up Sarah's flower beds in the process. Sarah tried to shoo him away, but Max just barked louder, as if defending his newfound territory. I knocked on the Johnsons' door, holding Max by the collar. Karen opened the door, looking more annoyed than concerned. "Hey, Max got into our yard again," I said, trying to keep my frustration in check. "He's been digging up the garden." Karen rolled her eyes. "He's just a dog. He's not hurting anyone." "It's not about hurting," I explained, my patience wearing thin. "We just need him to stay in your yard. Maybe you could reinforce the fence." "I'll think about it," she said dismissively, taking Max and shutting the door. But nothing changed. Max continued to break through the fence, and each time we brought it up, the Johnsons seemed less inclined to do anything about it. As if the noise and the mess weren't enough, the Johnsons soon started to cause problems with parking. They owned 3 cars and often had multiple guests over, leading to a constant struggle for street parking. They would park carelessly, sometimes blocking driveways, and on more than one occasion, we found ourselves unable to back out because one of their cars was partially blocking our driveway. We'd leave polite notes on their windshields asking them to be more considerate, but they were always ignored. One Saturday morning, I woke up to find their car parked across our driveway again. I knocked on their door, trying to remain calm despite my growing frustration. "Hey, your car is blocking our driveway again. I need to leave for work," I said when Steve answered. Steve just shrugged. "It's a public street, man. You don't own it, but you can't block someone's driveway," I argued. "It's common courtesy." Yeah, Steve muttered, slamming the door shut without moving the car. I ended up having to wait until one of their friends left before I could finally leave, making me late for work. After months of dealing with the Johnsons' behavior, the entire neighborhood was at its wit's end. Carol, our elderly neighbor, had had enough when she found beer cans in her front yard. The Thompsons, who lived on the other side of the Johnsons, were tired of the constant noise and parking issues. We decided to hold a neighborhood meeting to discuss what could be done. We all agreed that we didn't want things to escalate into a full-blown feud, but something had to change. The HOA sent a formal letter to the Johnsons, detailing the numerous complaints and requesting that they adhere to the community guidelines. The letter was met with a curt response, a handwritten note taped to the community bulletin board that read, "Mind your own business." The situation finally came to a head one particularly rowdy Saturday night. The Johnsons were having yet another loud party, and this time, things got out of hand. Around midnight, a fight broke out between some of their guests, spilling out into the street. Shouting and the sound of shattering glass woke up the entire neighborhood. Several neighbors, including us, called the police. When they arrived, the Johnsons tried to downplay the situation, but the officers weren't buying it this time. Steve was given a stern warning, and the party was finally shut down. The next morning, we found trash and broken bottles all over the street. Steve's car was parked on our lawn, its tires leaving muddy tracks in the grass. After the police incident, things seemed to simmer down. The Johnsons' parties became less frequent, and they started keeping to themselves more. The HOA imposed fines for repeated violations, and after several warnings, the Johnsons were forced to pay up or face further legal action. Eventually, the constant conflict seemed to wear them down. After about a year of back and forth, the Johnsons put their house up for sale. When the for sale sign went up, the neighborhood collectively breathed a sigh of relief. They moved out quietly, without any farewells or apologies. Their house sat empty for a few months before a new family moved in, a young couple with a baby on the way. We cautiously introduced ourselves, hoping that this time, things would be different. The Johnsons became the stuff of neighborhood lore, a cautionary tale about the importance of community and respect. While the tension eventually faded, the experience left a mark on all of us. We still talk about them sometimes, usually when we see someone new moving in. But as we look around our now peaceful neighborhood, with kids playing in the yards and neighbors chatting over fences, it's clear that we made it through together. And though the Johnsons were neighbors from hell, they also reminded us of the value of standing up for the community we love. Story 2. The Walls Have Ears. It started as a typical summer in the suburbs. The heat was relentless, and the hum of air conditioners was the neighborhood's constant background noise. I had just moved into my new home on Mulberry Street, a quiet, tree-lined lane that seemed perfect for starting fresh after my divorce. The house, an old brick colonial with a sprawling yard, had character, a bit worn but full of charm. It was everything I had dreamed of, a place where I could put down roots and rebuild my life. The first few weeks were blissfully uneventful. I spent my days unpacking boxes, painting walls, and getting to know the rhythms of the new house. The neighbors were polite but reserved. We exchanged nods and half-smiles over fences, but rarely more than that. It was an older neighborhood, filled mostly with retirees and longtime residents who had watched their children grow up and move away. Then, one evening, just as I was settling in with a glass of wine, I heard it, a dull, rhythmic thumping coming from the other side of the wall. It was faint but persistent, like someone was knocking softly, but continuously. I pressed my ear against the wall, trying to discern the source, but the sound was just indistinct enough to be maddening. I brushed it off as one of those old house noises, pipes settling, the house shifting, something benign. But the noise kept coming back, night after night, sometimes louder, sometimes softer, but always there. It was irritating, but not enough to confront the neighbors about it. It began with little annoyances. A pile of cigarette butts appeared near my back fence, even though I didn't smoke. My trash cans would be tipped over in the morning, their contents strewn across the driveway. I chalked it up to raccoons or teenagers playing pranks, but it was unsettling nonetheless. One day, as I was pulling into my driveway, I noticed my next-door neighbor, Mrs. Williams, standing at her window, staring at me. She was an older woman, probably in her late 70s, with a severe bun of white hair and a permanent scowl. I had only spoken to her once, briefly, when I moved in. She had seemed pleasant enough, if a bit distant, but now her gaze was cold, almost hostile. I waved tentatively, but she didn't respond. She just stood there, watching. The thumping continued. It was impossible to pinpoint where it was coming from. Sometimes it seemed to be above me, other times below, and occasionally it sounded as if it were right outside my bedroom window. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination, but it was becoming impossible to sleep. Every night, as soon as the house was quiet, the noise would start up again, a slow, methodical beat that seemed to pulse through the walls. One night, around 2 a.m., I decided I had had enough. I went outside, determined to find the source of the sound. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I walked around my house, then over to Mrs. Williams's, where the noise seemed loudest. Her house was dark, not a single light on. I hesitated for a moment, feeling foolish, before creeping closer to her back fence. And that's when I saw it, a faint glow from the basement window. I peered inside, and there was Mrs. Williams, sitting in an old sewing machine, methodically working on what looked like a quilt. The rhythmic thumping was the sound of the machine's pedal, pumping up and down. It was bizarre, almost surreal. Who sewed at 2 in the morning? I watched her for a moment longer, then backed away, feeling both relieved and unsettled. At least I had an answer, though it was far from satisfying. The next day, I decided to talk to her. I rehearsed my approach a dozen times in my head, trying to strike the right balance between concerned and non-confrontational. But when I knocked on her door, there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time, but still nothing. I even called out her name, but the house remained silent. I turned to leave, feeling embarrassed, when I noticed something odd. Her mailbox was stuffed full of letters and newspapers, some dating back weeks. It was strange. I had seen her just the night before. Why hadn't she been collecting her mail? I walked back to my house, my mind buzzing with questions. The thumping continued that night, louder than ever, and I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it all. The noise seemed almost alive, like a heartbeat pulsing through the house. Then things escalated. I started finding notes on my doorstep. They were scribbled on old pieces of paper with messages like "keep quiet" and "mind your own business." The handwriting was shaky and erratic, and the notes were always unsigned. I felt a chill every time I found one. It was as if someone was watching me, just waiting for the right moment to strike. I installed security cameras around my house, hoping to catch whoever was leaving the notes, but they didn't help. The notes kept coming, and the cameras showed nothing. No movement, no intruders, just empty footage. One morning, I woke up to find my front lawn covered in broken glass. Someone had smashed beer bottles all over the grass, leaving shards scattered everywhere. I spent hours cleaning it up, cursing under my breath, my hands shaking with anger and fear. I was convinced it was Mrs. Williams. Who else would have a reason to torment me? But without proof, there was nothing I could do. The breaking point came a few weeks later. It was a Sunday evening, and I was sitting in my living room, trying to relax, when I heard a loud crash from the backyard. I rushed outside, my heart pounding, to find that someone had thrown a rock through my kitchen window. Attached to the rock was another note, this one reading, "You don't belong here." That was it. I called the police. When the officers arrived, I told them everything: the noises, the notes, the vandalism. They took my statement, nodding sympathetically but offering little in the way of solutions. They promised to patrol the area more frequently and suggested I file a report. I insisted they speak to Mrs. Williams, convinced she was behind all of it. Reluctantly, they agreed. After about an hour, one of the officers returned, his face grave. "There's no one home," he said. "The house looks abandoned. We're going to try to contact any family members." "Abandoned?" I repeated, incredulous. "I just saw her last night." The officer looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Sir, Mrs. Williams passed away 2 months ago. The house has been empty ever since." I felt the blood drain from my face. "That's impossible," I stammered. "I've seen her. I heard her." The officer shook his head. "I don't know what you've been hearing, but no one's been in that house for weeks." I stared at the house, its windows dark and lifeless, and suddenly the world felt as if it had shifted beneath my feet. All this time, I had been haunted by something far more terrifying than an angry neighbor. The thumping, the notes, the vandalism, none of it made sense anymore. I didn't know what to believe. The police increased their patrols, but the incident stopped after that night. The thumping noise ceased, and the notes never reappeared. Mrs. Williams's house was eventually sold, and a young couple moved in, brightening the old place with fresh paint and cheerful landscaping. But I could never shake the feeling that something was off, that some unseen presence still lingered between our walls. I tried to move on, but the events of that summer stayed with me, like a shadow that wouldn't fade. I eventually sold my house, unable to bear the memories it held. To this day, I still don't know what was real and what wasn't. But every now and then, when I'm alone in a quiet room, I hear it, that faint, rhythmic thumping, like the beat of a heart that refuses to stop. And I wonder if some doors are better left unopened, some questions better left unanswered. Because sometimes, the worst nightmares aren't the ones we dream. They're the ones waiting just beyond the walls, where the past never quite lets go. Story 3. The Yard Sale. When Martin and I first moved into the cul-de-sac on Willow Street, everything seemed perfect. It was the kind of neighborhood you see in real estate brochures. Well-kept lawns, kids playing basketball, and neighbors who always waved and smiled. Our new house was a charming mid-century bungalow with a decent backyard that Martin was eager to turn into a garden. After years of saving up, we were thrilled to finally have our own home. It felt like everything was finally coming together for us. Our next-door neighbors, the Stewarts, were the first ones to greet us. Dan was in his 60s, retired electrician with a loud laugh that carried across the street. His wife, Claire, was much quieter and seemed a bit anxious. They'd lived on the street for decades and were full of local knowledge. They welcomed us with cookies and a binder of neighborhood info, trash pickup schedules, emergency contacts, and a list of every neighbor's contact details. It was a bit overwhelming, but also kind of sweet. We joked about it later, but appreciated their effort to make us feel welcome. For a while, everything was fine. We got into our routines, and the Stewarts were friendly enough. Dan was always quick to lend a hand with small home repairs, and they'd wave whenever we saw them. But as summer turned to fall, I started noticing some strange things. Claire would often be at her window, just staring out at us. Whenever I'd catch her eye, she'd quickly disappear. One morning, while I was taking out the trash, I saw Claire in her garden. She gave me a strained smile, looking a bit disheveled. I tried to shake it off, but her behavior started to get under my skin. Then came the noise. Every night around midnight, we'd hear this loud, grinding sound from their garage. It was like someone was using a power tool, buzzing, whirring, and clanging metal. It would go on for hours, sometimes until 3 or 4 in the morning. At first, we thought it was just a project Dan was working on. He seemed like the handy type. But after a couple of weeks, it was really starting to get to us. One evening, Martin decided to confront them about the noise. He knocked on their door, and after a long pause, Dan answered, looking pretty annoyed. Martin mentioned the noise, and Dan just grunted, saying it was home repairs and they'd try to keep it down. But nothing changed. The grinding continued, and Dan's attitude was starting to wear thin. I tried talking to Claire a few days later while she was watering her plants. She looked startled when I approached. When I mentioned the noise, she stammered and said it was just Dan's hobby. She promised she'd talk to him, but she seemed nervous, and I felt like she wasn't telling me the whole truth. The noise didn't just persist. It got worse. It wasn't just grinding anymore. There were loud bangs and crashes, and sometimes it sounded like someone was shouting. Martin and I lay awake, exhausted, trying everything to drown out the sound, but nothing worked. Then, they started having these yard sales almost every weekend. Their driveway would be cluttered with old tools, broken appliances, and random junk. It was strange how often they had these sales, and the stuff they were selling seemed like it belonged in a junkyard. But people kept coming, haggling over things that looked pretty worthless. One Saturday, I decided to check out the sale. Claire was behind one of the tables, looking more frazzled than usual. I picked up an old clock and asked her where they found all this stuff. Claire gave me a blank look for a second before forcing a smile. Dan's clearing out his old workshop. I mentioned I didn't realize he was a collector, and she quickly said he's not. It's just old junk. As I was leaving, a man in a baseball cap picked up a box of rusted chains and paid Claire in cash without saying much. The whole exchange was odd, and I started to think there was something more going on with these sales. The grinding noise became a nightly nuisance. Then, one night, we heard a blood-curdling scream. It cut through the noise and was definitely coming from their house. Martin and I rushed outside and went to their driveway. The garage door was slightly open, and I saw Dan inside, his back to us. The noise stopped abruptly when we arrived. I called out, but Dan didn't turn around. He just stood there blocking whatever was behind him. I was scared to go in. "What's going on, Dan?" Martin asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Dan turned around slowly, his face expressionless. "Just working on something. Nothing to worry about." Before we could say anything else, Dan slammed the garage door shut. We stood there, stunned, not sure what to do. Martin wanted to call the police, but we didn't have any concrete evidence. We went back home, but I barely slept that night, disturbed by the scream. In the weeks that followed, their yard sales continued, but Dan seemed increasingly agitated. The strange people showing up at odd hours only added to the weirdness. It was clear that whatever Dan was involved in, it was more than just selling junk. Then one night things took a turn. We were woken by a loud crash coming from their garage. We looked outside and saw a flickering light, like a fire. We went over and pounded on their door. No answer. I heard muffled shouting and the sound of something heavy being dragged. Thank you so much for watching. Kindly like and subscribe. Wishing you endless love and all the good vibes. Stay amazing. See you in the next one.